There are nights when the world feels too loud, too bright, too insistent on answers that may not exist. This is not one of those nights. Tonight, we slow down. We sit with questions that have lingered for thousands of years, written in languages most of us will never read, preserved on clay tablets that crumbled in hands we will never know. We are not here to solve mysteries. We are here to listen to what was written, to understand what was believed, and to recognize that the distance between those two things is where most of human meaning lives. The ancient world recorded catastrophes. It recorded them in detail. It recorded them with precision that troubles the comfortable assumption that mythology is simply fantasy dressed in divine costume. Some of these records describe cities consumed by fire. They describe stones falling from the sky. They describe landscapes turned to ash and salt. They describe survivors who could not explain what they had witnessed, who reached for the only language available to them, the language of gods and judgment, of cosmic intervention and divine fury. We're going to explore those records tonight, not to prove anything, not to claim we have discovered what historians missed, but to ask what happens when we take these texts seriously, when we read them not as primitive confusion, but as genuine attempts to preserve memory, to warn future generations, to make sense of events that defied the frameworks of their time. This is about what was written. It is not about what we must believe. It is not about choosing sides in ancient debates or modern ones. It is about sitting with the texts themselves, with the weight of what they describe, with the possibility that some catastrophes were remembered across cultures not because the stories were borrowed, but because the events were real, witnessed, and too immense to forget. If that resonates with you, if this kind of careful, slow exploration feels like something you want more of, then consider subscribing, not because you are being sold something, but because this approach, this patience, this refusal to sensationalize is uncommon. It takes time to build. It depends on people who value it. If you do, you are welcome here. Before we go further, a small human question. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? Are you in darkness or in the last light of evening? Are you alone or surrounded by the quiet breathing of others? There is something meaningful about knowing that these words, this exploration, is happening in different places, different hours, across distances that would have seemed impossible to the people whose texts we're about to examine. Leave a comment if you feel moved to. It matters less than you think and more than you know. The Sumerians did not begin their records with explanations. They began with names. They named their gods the way we name forces we cannot control but must live beside. Anu, the sky; Enlil, the storm; Enki, the water; and the deep. These were not abstract concepts. They were powers that shaped the world, powers that could nurture or destroy, powers that required respect, ritual, and sometimes desperate negotiation. The Anunnaki appear in Sumerian texts as a collective. They are described as judges, as decision-makers, as beings who descend from the heavens and whose actions ripple through human history. Later traditions, much later, would reshape these figures into alien visitors, into genetic engineers, into colonizers from distant planets. We are not following those traditions tonight. We are staying with the sources, with what the tablets actually say. The Anunnaki, in the oldest texts, are divine. They are part of a cosmology that sees the heavens and the earth as connected, as interpenetrating, as governed by laws that humans can observe but not fully comprehend. They are not metaphors for ignorance. They are frameworks for understanding. When a Sumerian scribe carved a story into clay, he was not inventing fiction for entertainment. He was preserving knowledge. He was recording what had been passed down, what had been witnessed, what had been survived. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains within it an older story, the story of a flood so vast, so total that it erased nearly everything. Utnapishti, the survivor, describes it in language that feels more like trauma than myth. He describes a storm that blackened the sky. He describes gods who wept at what they had unleashed. He describes silence afterward, the kind of silence that comes when everything has ended. Other cultures recorded floods. The Hebrew Bible records one. Greek traditions record them. Indian texts record them. South American oral histories record them. The details differ, the geography differs, but the structure of the memory is consistent. A world-ending event, a handful of survivors, a struggle to rebuild, a warning embedded in the retelling. We do not need to claim these floods were all the same event. But we also do not need to dismiss them as coincidence or borrowed storytelling. Floods happened. Catastrophic ones. Ones that reshaped coastlines and river valleys, that drowned settlements, that became the defining trauma of entire civilizations. The fact that they were remembered as divine judgment tells us how people understood causation. It does not tell us the events did not happen. The texts we are interested in tonight describe something different from a flood. They describe fire. They describe destruction that came from above, that turned stone to glass, that left landscapes uninhabitable. The most famous of these accounts is biblical, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis chapter 19 describes it in verses that have been read, debated, interpreted, and reinterpreted for millennia. The text is short. The language is direct. The Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah. He overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. Abraham looked toward the land and saw dense smoke rising from it, like smoke from a furnace. This is not vague mythology. This is specific. Sulfur, total destruction. Vegetation gone. Smoke like a furnace. A woman transformed into salt. The language suggests immediacy, physicality, something that happened in an instant. Whether this is metaphor or memory, the text does not say. It only describes what was seen or what was believed to have been seen. For most of history, this was read as miracle, as divine punishment made manifest, as proof that God acts directly in human affairs, that cities can be erased for their transgressions, that judgment is real and terrible. But in the 20th century, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after humanity had seen what nuclear fire actually does, some readers began to see the text differently, not as miracle, as description, as the best possible words available to describe something that would not be understood for thousands of years. A blast from above, instant incineration, ash and salt, smoke rising like a furnace, heat so intense that turning toward it might mean something the text can only describe as becoming salt, as being caught in the moment of witnessing. This interpretation is not proven. It cannot be proven from the text alone. But once it is suggested, some find it difficult to ignore. The language seems to fit. The details appear to align. The aftermath shares qualities with what we now know happens in certain catastrophic events. We must be careful here. We must not claim certainty where none exists. But we also must not dismiss the possibility simply because it troubles our assumptions about the ancient world. The question is not whether the people of Sodom and Gomorrah deserve destruction. The question is what actually happened to them, and whether the record we have is mythological overlay on moral, teaching or eyewitness description translated into the only vocabulary available. There are other texts, lesser known, rarely discussed outside academic circles. The Error epic, a Babylonian poem, describes Error, a god of plague and destruction, laying waste to cities with fire that falls from heaven. The language is violent, visceral, detailed. The cities burn, the survivors flee, the land becomes cursed. The Mahabharata, the ancient Indian epic, contains passages that describe weapons called astras, divine weapons capable of levelling entire armies, of burning the sky, of rendering lands poisoned for generations. The descriptions are extensive. They mention brilliant light, heat that boils water, soldiers who remove their armour because it burns their skin, a cloud that rises like a pillar, deaths that come not from impact but from invisible sickness in the days and weeks afterward. Western scholars largely ignored these passages for centuries, reading them as poetic exaggeration, as mythological inflation of conventional warfare. But some readers have noticed a troubling resemblance to what we now recognise as exposure to extreme heat, contamination, and sickness that arrives after the moment of impact. The details invite a slower reading. They may be poetic exaggeration, they may be memory-shaped into myth, but the precision is worth noting. The Sumerian king list, a document that records the reigns of kings before and after the flood, contains a strange notation. It divides history into two eras. Before the flood, kings reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans drop dramatically, becoming more consistent with human biology as we understand it. Scholars have offered many explanations: symbolic time, dynastic compression, mythological inflation. But there is another reading, quieter, less comfortable, that something changed, that the world before the flood and the world after were biologically different, that whatever catastrophe ended the first era altered the conditions of human life in ways that shortened lifespans, that introduced new vulnerabilities, that marked a permanent shift in what it meant to be human on this planet. Radiation does this. Radiation alters DNA. It shortens telomeres. It increases mutation rates. It makes subsequent generations more fragile, more prone to illness, less capable of the extremes of endurance that earlier populations might have exhibited. If the flood was not only water but also something that poisoned the environment, that saturated the world with particles that decayed slowly, invisibly, then the pattern we see in the King list begins to make a different kind of sense. Not mythological, biological. We do not have physical evidence of ancient nuclear war in Mesopotamia. We do not have craters clearly dated to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. We do not have isotopic signatures that unambiguously point to artificial fission, but we do have glass. In the deserts of the Near East, in Egypt, in parts of India, there are areas where the sand has been fused into glass. Trinitite is the name given to the green glass found at the Trinity test site in New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb was detonated. It forms when sand is exposed to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Natural processes can create glass, lightning strikes, meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions. But the distribution of desert glass in some regions does not align neatly with these explanations. The fields are too large, the deposits too uniform, the lack of associated impact craters too conspicuous. In the Libyan desert, there is an area covering more than 6,000 square kilometers where yellow-green glass lies scattered across the surface. Some pieces weigh kilograms. The glass is pure silica, nearly 98%. The temperatures required to produce it exceed anything a normal fire could generate. Meteor impact was the leading theory for decades, but no crater has been found, no evidence of the shock structures that meteor impacts leave behind. The glass is simply there, spread across a region that was once inhabited, once fertile, now barren. Similar glass has been found in the Negev, in the regions near where Sodom and Gomorrah are traditionally located. The concentrations are smaller. The dating is imprecise, but the presence of fused silica in areas associated with ancient catastrophe narratives is worth noting, not as proof, as data point, as something that does not easily fit the conventional explanations. The Dead Sea itself is strange. It sits in a rift valley, below sea level, surrounded by cliffs and wasteland. Its water is nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean. Almost nothing lives in it. The Greeks called it the asphalt lake because chunks of bitumen, natural tar, rise to the surface and float like black stone. The air smells of sulfur. The landscape is lifeless. In ancient times, this region was described differently. Genesis chapter 13 describes the valley of the Jordan as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. It was fertile. It supported cities. Then, after the destruction, it became what it is now. Wasteland. Some geologists argue this is natural, the result of tectonic activity, of the Arabian plate pulling away from the African plate, of subsidence and salt deposit over millennia. Others point out that the transformation described in Genesis is not gradual. It is sudden, complete. A fertile plain turned into a toxic sea in a single event. There are layers of ash in the sediment around the Dead Sea, layers that contain materials consistent with intense burning, layers that disrupt the normal stratigraphy, that suggest something violent and rapid. The dating of these layers is debated. Some place them around the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, roughly consistent with traditional estimates for the time of Abraham. Others place them earlier or later. The precision is not there, but the fact of sudden, catastrophic burning is. Lot's wife is one of the most haunting images in the biblical text. She looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. For generations this was read as punishment for disobedience, for attachment to the sinful city, for failure to trust in God's command. But if we read it as description rather than moral lesson, the image changes. She looks back toward the blast, toward the light, toward the destruction expanding over the cities. Some have wondered whether the image preserves a memory of intense heat and mineral air, the kind that can leave salt and ash clinging to bodies and stone. Others read it as pure moral warning. The text allows both, and it never tells us which is true. There are photographs from Hiroshima, shadows burned into stone where people stood when the blast wave hit, outlines on steps, on walls, where human bodies blocked the light for a fraction of a second before they ceased to exist. These shadows are all that remain. No bodies, just the memory of presence etched into the environment by heat beyond comprehension. Lot's wife may be the same kind of memory, not myth, not punishment, but the description of a woman who saw something no one should see, whose final form became a marker for future generations. Do not look back, do not turn toward the fire, keep moving, or you will become part of the destruction you are fleeing. The text tells Abraham that he looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and saw smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. He is far away when he sees this, far enough to survive, close enough to witness. The smoke is not normal, it is dense. It rises in a specific way, like a furnace, like something burning from within, like a column of heat and ash that climbs into the sky and spreads. This is what mushroom clouds look like, from a distance, from the perspective of someone who does not have the language to describe nuclear detonation, but who has eyes that work, who can see the shape of the smoke, who can record what he witnessed in the only terms available. A furnace, a pillar, dense smoke that rises and rises. We are not claiming Abraham witnessed a nuclear event. We are saying the description he provides is consistent with one, that if such an event occurred, this is what the survivor of it, watching from a distance, would write. The Anunnaki, in later cuneiform texts, are sometimes described as possessing weapons that shake the earth, that command fire, that destroy without leaving survivors. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes conflicts among the gods in which entire landscapes are reshaped, in which mountains are leveled, in which the defeated are erased so completely that even their names are lost. These were read as cosmic allegory, as mythological representations of natural forces. But what if they were also memory? What if the gods were not only symbols, but also actors, beings with technology, with knowledge, with the capacity to do what ancient peoples described them doing? The Sumerian term Anunnaki can be translated as those who from heaven to earth came. The etymology is debated. But the basic meaning is consistent across sources. They came from above, they descended, they acted in the world and then withdrew, leaving behind only the consequences and the stories. If beings came from elsewhere, if they had technology, if they had conflicts among themselves, then the destruction of cities, the scarring of landscapes, the sudden collapse of civilizations begins to look less like divine caprice and more like collateral damage, not punishment, consequence. We are speculating now. We must acknowledge that. We are moving beyond what the texts directly state and into interpretation. But speculation is not fantasy when it is grounded in careful reading, when it follows the evidence the text provide, when it refuses to impose modern categories on ancient thinking while also refusing to dismiss ancient thinking as primitive. The people who wrote these texts were not stupid. They were not confused children inventing stories to explain thunder. They were observers, G-recorders, survivors. They saw something. They wrote it down. We are trying to understand what they saw. The archaeological record shows something troubling across the ancient Near East. Around the end of the early Bronze Age, roughly between 4,200 and 4,000 years ago, there is a widespread collapse. Cities are abandoned, trade networks dissolve, populations decline sharply, some areas depopulate entirely. For decades, archaeologists attributed this to climate change, to drought, to the gradual failure of agricultural systems. And climate was certainly a factor. Sediment cores show reduced rainfall, pollen records show vegetation stress. But climate change does not explain the totality of what happened. It does not explain the burn layers. It does not explain the sudden abandonment of cities that had thrived for centuries. It does not explain why some sites show evidence of intense fire that consumed not just buildings, but the ground itself, leaving vitrified brick and melted stone. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, shows destruction layers consistent with extreme heat. Babed-Dra and Numeira, two sites near the Dead Sea that some scholars identify as possible locations for Sodom and Gomorrah, were destroyed suddenly and never reoccupied. The burn layers at these sites are thick. They contain ash, sulfur compounds, and materials consistent with temperatures far exceeding normal urban fires. The roofs collapsed inward, the walls show blast patterns, and then nothing. No rebuilding, no new settlement, just abandonment and silence. The traditional explanation is earthquake followed by fire. The region is seismically active. The Dead Sea Transform Fault runs directly through the area. Earthquakes would have been common, devastating, capable of toppling cities and igniting fires from overturned oil lamps and cooking fires. But earthquakes do not explain the distribution of destruction. They do not explain why some sites were obliterated while nearby settlements survived. They do not explain the temperatures involved, which exceed what organic fuel fires can produce. They do not explain the sulfur concentrations, which are anomalously high. One reading of the evidence is that multiple catastrophes occurred in close succession: earthquake, fire, perhaps volcanic activity, perhaps a meteor airburst. Each explanation accounts for part of the data but not all of it. The other reading, quieter, less academically comfortable, is that the catastrophe was singular and intentional, that it came from above, that it was directed at specific targets, that it was, in other words, exactly what the texts describe: war. Ancient people understood war. They recorded it extensively. They knew what cities looked like after siege, after conquest, after human violence. The destructions described in the texts about Sodom and Gomorrah are not described as war. They are described as something else, something that came from the sky, something that involved fire but not armies, something that left no victors, only wasteland. If the Anunnaki were not gods but beings, if they had conflicts, if they used weapons we would now recognize as advanced, then the pattern begins to cohere. Not as mythology, as history recorded in theological language. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as judges. They determine the fates of cities and kings. They have assemblies where decisions are made. They argue among themselves. They show favoritism. They change their minds. This is not how eternal, omnipotent gods are usually described. Eternal gods do not argue. They do not have assemblies. They do not change their minds based on advocacy or debate. They simply are, and their will is absolute. But the Anunnaki are described more like a council, like a body of powerful individuals who must negotiate, who have different interests, who sometimes act in concert and sometimes do not. Enlil wants to destroy humanity during the flood. Enki opposes him, secretly warns Utnapishtim, ensures survival. The flood happens, but it is not total. Humanity endures. Enlil is angry but accepts the outcome. This is political. This is the behavior of beings with agency, with limitations, with the capacity to be overruled or circumvented. If we take this seriously, if we read it as description rather than symbolic drama, then the destructions attributed to the Anunnaki or to the gods more broadly might not be expressions of moral judgment, but outcomes of decisions made for reasons we do not fully understand, recorded by people who had no framework for understanding them except divine action. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for wickedness, according to Genesis, but what was the wickedness? The text is vague. Sexual immorality is implied. Inhospitality is explicit. The men of the city surround Lot's house and demand access to his guests. Lot offers his daughters instead. The guests, described as angels, strike the men blind and warn Lot to flee. This is a strange story. It does not read like straightforward moral teaching. It reads like confusion, like an attempt to make sense of something that did not fit normal categories. The guests are described as angels, but the Hebrew word is malakim, which means messengers. Messengers from where? Doing what? They are physically present. They eat food. They can be touched. They are not ethereal spirits. They are beings in bodies who have come to assess the city, who determine it must be destroyed, who have the authority to carry out that destruction. If they were not divine but simply representatives of a power beyond human comprehension, the story does not change much in structure. They arrive, they assess, they warn the righteous to leave, they execute the city. The framework is judgment, but the mechanism is physical. Fire from the sky, heat, blast, calcification. The guests tell Lot to flee to the mountains, to not look back, to move quickly, because they cannot act until he is safe. This is not how omnipotent beings speak. Omnipotent beings do not need to wait. They do not have constraints. They do not express concern about collateral damage. But these messengers do. They have a limited window. They have rules of engagement. They cannot proceed until the non-combatants are clear. This language makes sense if the destruction is technological, if there is a blast radius, if there is targeting involved, if there are protocols to minimize unintended casualties. It makes less sense if the destruction is miraculous, because miracles can be infinitely precise, can spare the righteous even in the midst of the wicked, do not require evacuation or safe distance. The text preserves details that suggest limits, constraints, physical mechanics. It preserves them because that is what happened. The people writing it down did not understand the technology, but they recorded the behavior accurately. The Error epic describes similar constraints. Error, the god of destruction, is counseled by his weapon, his divine mace, which urges him to act, to destroy the cities that have become corrupt. But even Error hesitates. He negotiates. He is warned by other gods that the destruction will have consequences beyond the intended targets, that the innocent will suffer, that the land will be cursed. He acts anyway. The cities burn, and afterward there is regret, not from the victims who are dead, from the gods themselves. They did not anticipate the totality of it. They did not foresee how far the poison would spread, how long the land would remain uninhabitable. This is not the behavior of omniscient deities. This is the behavior of beings who make decisions with incomplete information, who have power but not perfect knowledge, who must live with the consequences of their actions. If the Anunnaki were such beings, if they fought among themselves, if they used weapons capable of destroying cities, then the regret makes sense. The warnings make sense. The attempts to limit the damage, to spare some while destroying others, make sense. And the failure to fully control the outcomes, the lingering contamination, the generations of suffering that followed, make sense. Not as divine mystery, as the predictable result of using weapons too powerful to be fully controlled. The Mahabharata describes the aftermath of the divine weapons. It describes lands where no crops grow. It describes water that cannot be drunk. It describes animals born deformed. It describes warriors who survived the battle, but died in the days afterward, their skin falling away, their hair dropping out, their bodies failing from the inside. This is radiation sickness. The progression, the symptoms, the time frame, all match. The text does not use the word radiation because the concept did not exist, but it describes the effects with precision that is difficult to dismiss. In one passage, a warrior named Ashwathama uses a weapon called the Brahmastra. The text says it released a force like 10,000 suns. It says a great column of fire rose into the sky. It says the heat was so intense that warriors threw themselves into rivers to escape it, but the water boiled and they died anyway. It says those who survived could not eat, could not sleep, could not think clearly. It says their weapons and armor became cursed and had to be abandoned. Some readers have noticed that these symptoms, this progression, this pattern of delayed illness, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to what we would now describe differently. It may be metaphor. It may be the exaggeration of conventional warfare elevated to mythic scale. But the precision of the sequence, the specificity of the details invites consideration. The text does not use modern terminology because that terminology did not exist, but it describes effects that some find difficult to explain through Bronze Age warfare alone. We must be careful. We must not claim certainty. But we must also not ignore what was written simply because it challenges our assumptions about technological history. The Standard Model says that advanced technology is recent, that nuclear weapons were invented in the 20th century, that ancient peoples had bronze and stone, agriculture and writing, but nothing that could release energies comparable to stellar processes. But the Standard Model also struggles to explain the texts. It struggles to explain the glass. It struggles to explain the burn layers, the sudden collapses, the long-term contamination of specific regions. The alternative model says that technology has risen and fallen before, that civilizations have reached heights and then been destroyed, their knowledge lost, their achievements buried or forgotten. That we are not the first to split the atom, only the first in this particular cycle. This model is speculative. It is not proven, but it accounts for data that the Standard Model dismisses or ignores. It takes the text seriously as records rather than fantasies. It allows for the possibility that ancient people knew things, saw things, survived things that we are only now beginning to understand. The question is not which model is true. The question is which model best fits the evidence we have, both textual and physical. And the answer is not as clear as we might wish. There are scholars who have argued for ancient advanced technology, They are not mainstream. They are often dismissed as fringe, as pseudoscience, as wishful thinking dressed in academic language. Some of them deserve that dismissal. They make claims without evidence. They cherry-pick data. They confuse correlation with causation. But some of them are careful. They follow the sources. They acknowledge uncertainty. They simply suggest that the evidence is more complex than the standard narrative allows. These scholars point to the precision of ancient engineering, the megaliths that cannot be replicated with the tools we assume were available, the astronomical alignments that require knowledge of precession, of planetary cycles, of mathematics that supposedly had not been developed yet, the metallurgical sophistication evident in artifacts that predate the supposed invention of the necessary techniques. None of this proves ancient nuclear war. But it establishes that the ancient world was more capable, more knowledgeable, more advanced in specific domains than the standard model acknowledges. And if that is true, if ancient peoples had capabilities we do not credit them with, then the possibility that they also had destructive capabilities becomes less absurd. The texts describe kingship as descending from heaven. The Sumerian king list begins with the line, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Kingship is not presented as a human invention. It is presented as something given, something taught, something that came from elsewhere. The same is true of other arts. Writing is attributed to the gods. Agriculture is a gift from divine beings. Metalworking is taught by the Anunnaki. The laws are delivered from heaven. This could be mythology. It could be the way oral cultures explain the origins of their key technologies, by attributing them to the sacred, by placing them beyond human invention. Or it could be memory. Memory of a time when beings from elsewhere did teach these things, when knowledge was not discovered gradually through trial and error, but transmitted directly, systematically, by those who already possessed it. If such a transmission occurred, it would have seemed miraculous. It would have been interpreted theologically, but it would also have been real. The knowledge would have worked. The technologies would have functioned. And the memory of where they came from, however it was framed, would have been preserved. Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and water, is described as the one who brought knowledge to humanity. He is portrayed as subversive, as acting against the will of other gods, as favouring humans even when it costs him. In the flood narrative, he is the one who warns Utnapishtim. In other texts, he is the one who teaches humanity the arts of civilization, who gives them the me, the divine principles that govern reality. The me include kingship, priesthood, writing, music, craftsmanship, warfare. They are not abstract ideals, they are concrete knowledge sets, and Enki distributes them, sometimes over the objections of other gods who believe humans should remain ignorant, should remain subservient. This is a strange mythology if it is only mythology. Why would gods argue about whether humans should have knowledge? Why would some gods favour human advancement while others oppose it? If gods are simply personifications of natural forces or moral principles, this conflict makes little sense. But if the gods were beings with agendas, with differing views on what role humanity should play, with political struggles among themselves, then the conflict becomes coherent. Enki wants humans empowered. Enlil wants them controlled. The tension between these positions shapes human history, and occasionally that tension erupts into violence, into destructions that are remembered as divine wrath but might have been something else, something more like purges, like the elimination of populations that had become too independent, too knowledgeable, too capable of threatening the established order. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed not only for wickedness, but because they have crossed a threshold. They have become something that cannot be tolerated. The text does not specify what that threshold was. But it was enough to warrant total eradication, not conquest, not subjugation. Eradication. That is not normal even in the brutal logic of ancient warfare. Normal warfare aims at control, at extraction, at establishing dominance. Eradication is reserved for threats, for enemies so dangerous that their continued existence is unacceptable. What could Sodom and Gomorrah have been doing that merited this response? The text offers moral explanations: immorality, inhospitality, corruption. But these are common. Every city in the ancient world had immorality and corruption. Most were not destroyed. So what made these cities different? What made them intolerable? One possibility, never stated explicitly but hinted at in later rabbinic traditions, is that they had knowledge they should not have, that they had learned things, developed things, understood things that placed them outside the acceptable bounds, that they were, in other words, approaching the status of the gods themselves, and that could not be allowed. The Tower of Babel is another such story. Humanity comes together. They build a tower to reach heaven. They work in unity, speaking one language, coordinating their efforts, and God, or the gods, look down and say, if they can do this, nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So the languages are confused. The project is abandoned. Humanity is scattered. This is not punishment for sin. This is preemptive action against potential, against the possibility that humans might become too powerful, too unified, too capable of challenging the order that the gods have established. If we read these stories as memory rather than moral fable, a pattern emerges. Humanity advances. Humanity approaches a threshold. The threshold is noticed. The response is swift and total. Flood, confusion, destruction. The cycle resets, and humanity begins again, diminished, fragmented, forced to rediscover what was lost. This is not a comforting reading. It suggests that the catastrophes that punctuate human history are not natural, not random, not the inevitable result of hubris or moral failure, but deliberate, controlled, part of a system designed to ensure that humans never become too much, never threaten the powers that govern the world from positions we cannot see or reach. But this is interpretation layered on interpretation. We have moved far from the texts themselves. Let us return to them. Let's return to what was actually written and ask what it meant to the people who wrote it. The people of the ancient Near East lived in a world where the divine was immediate. Gods were not abstractions. They were presences. They acted. They intervened. They made demands. They punished and rewarded. This was not superstition. This was the framework through which reality was understood. When a city was destroyed, it was because the gods had willed it. When a king triumphed, it was because the gods favoured him. When crops failed, it was because the gods were displeased. This worldview is foreign to modern secular thinking. We explain events through chains of natural causation: weather, geology, economics, politics. We do not invoke divine will unless we are speaking metaphorically or personally, and even then we distinguish between what we believe privately and what we claim as public fact. The ancient world made no such distinction. The public fact was divine action. The question was not whether the gods acted, but why. What had been done to provoke them? What could be done to appease them? How could future anger be avoided? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah fit into this framework seamlessly. The cities were wicked. God destroyed them. The survivors bore witness. The memory was preserved as warning. Do not become like Sodom. Do not provoke the divine. Do not imagine that safety is guaranteed or that wrongdoing will go unpunished. This reading served the community. It reinforced moral boundaries. It reminded people that power beyond their control could be turned against them at any moment. It made survival contingent on obedience, on staying within the limits of acceptable behaviour. But moral framework and factual description are not mutually exclusive. The cities could have been destroyed. The destruction could have been real, physical, overwhelming. And the interpretation of that destruction as divine judgment could have been the only way to make sense of it, to integrate it into the worldview available at the time. We do this still. When disasters strike, people ask why. They search for meaning. They construct narratives that make the suffering comprehensible, that place it within a larger story. Sometimes those narratives are theological. God is testing us. God is punishing us. God has a plan we cannot see. Sometimes they are political. This happened because of what they did, because of policies, decisions, failures of leadership. Sometimes they are existential. Suffering is random. There is no why. We endure because we must. The form of the narrative changes, but the impulse is the same. We cannot bear meaningless suffering. We need it to mean something, even if that meaning is dark, even if it indicts us. The ancient interpretation of catastrophe as divine judgment was not ignorance. It was sense-making. It was the application of the best explanatory model available. And it worked, in the sense that it allowed communities to continue, to rebuild, to carry forward the memory of what had happened while also extracting lessons that could guide future behaviour. But sense-making is not the same as accuracy. And just because a narrative serves a purpose does not mean it correctly identifies causes. The question we are left with is whether the ancient texts preserve, beneath the theological interpretation, a stratum of factual description. Whether the fire was real, whether the blast was real, whether the aftermath, the poisoned land, the uninhabitable ruins, the shadows calcified into salt, were real, and if they were real, what caused them. The biblical text does not provide a mechanism. It says God rained down sulfur. It does not explain how. It does not describe the process. It simply asserts the action and records the result. This is consistent with eyewitness testimony. Witnesses describe what they see, not how it works. They do not have access to mechanisms, they have access to effects. A person in Hiroshima who survived the blast might say, "The sky flashed brighter than the sun. A wall of wind threw me to the ground. When I stood up, the city was gone." They would not say, "A uranium-235 core achieved critical mass, initiating a fission chain reaction that released energy equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT." They would not have the concepts, they would not have the language, they would have the experience, the memory of light, of heat, of wind, of silence afterward, the memory of bodies that were no longer bodies, of buildings that were no longer buildings, of a city that had been full of life one moment and was ash the next. If they tried to write it down, if they tried to explain what had happened, they would reach for the largest concepts available. Divine action, the wrath of heaven, fire from the sky, and they would be describing accurately what they witnessed. They would simply not be explaining in technical terms what caused it. The same is true of the Sumerian and Babylonian texts. They describe gods unleashing weapons. They describe cities consumed. They describe lands that remain cursed. They do not explain nuclear physics, but they describe the observable effects of processes that we now associate with nuclear physics. The flash, the heat, the blast, the column of smoke, the long-term contamination, the shortened lifespans, the mutations. These are not scattered images, they form a coherent pattern, and the pattern matches, not perfectly, not unambiguously, but closely enough that dismissing it requires effort, requires explaining away details that seem almost too specific to be coincidental. The sulfur mentioned in Genesis is particularly interesting. Sulfur, brimstone, is associated with volcanic activity. It can be released by geothermal processes, by the combustion of organic material, by certain types of chemical reactions. But the concentrations described, the way it is distributed, the fact that it is coupled with total incineration, suggests something more intense than normal geological processes. Sulfur compounds are also produced in nuclear explosions. The heat causes atmospheric nitrogen and oxygen to combine, forming nitrogen oxides and sulfur compounds if sulfur-bearing materials are present in the target zone. The Dead Sea region has natural sulfur deposits, bitumen, asphalt, organic rich sediments. If a nuclear device, or something functionally similar, detonated over this region, it would vaporize those materials, distribute them widely, and leave behind concentrations of sulfur far exceeding normal levels. The text would then be describing, accurately, what rained down: burning sulfur, not as a miraculous substance, but as the byproduct of extreme heat interacting with the local geology. We must be cautious, we must not overreach, but we also must not refuse to see what the texts are showing us simply because it does not fit the story we have told ourselves about technological history. The story we tell is that humans progressed linearly, from stone to bronze to iron to steel to silicon, from ignorance to knowledge, from superstition to science. This story is comforting. It makes us the culmination. It makes history a tale of ascent, of improvement, of inevitable progress. But the evidence does not always support this story. The evidence shows collapses, shows knowledge lost, shows civilizations that fell so completely that their successors did not even remember they had existed. The Bronze Age collapse around 3,200 years ago erased entire cultures. The Hittites vanished, Mycenaean Greece fell, the trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries dissolved. Literacy declined, populations crashed. For centuries afterward, the region was poorer, darker, less connected than it had been. The knowledge of how to work bronze, of how to navigate long distances, of how to administer complex states, was not entirely lost, but it became rare, fragmented, localized. And when civilizations began to rebuild, they did not simply resume where the previous age had ended. They started over in many ways. They rediscovered. They reinvented. The texts from before the collapse became mysterious, difficult to read, full of references to places and peoples that no longer existed. If collapse can happen once, it can happen many times. If knowledge can be lost within a few generations, then the possibility that advanced knowledge existed in deeper antiquity and was lost becomes less absurd. We do not have an unbroken record. We have fragments, ruins, texts that survived, by accident, copied and recopied by scribes who often did not fully understand what they were preserving. What we know about the ancient world is a fraction of what existed. Most of it is gone, burned, buried, eroded, forgotten. The texts that describe catastrophes, that hint at advanced capabilities, that preserve details inconsistent with the standard model, are among the fragments we have. They are not proof, but they are data, and data should not be dismissed simply because it is inconvenient. Let us consider the human cost, not the mechanics, not the theories, the human cost. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah, whoever they were, whatever they had done, died. They died suddenly. They died in fire. Some of them were incinerated instantly. Some of them burned. Some of them fled and were caught by the blast or the heat or the ash. Some of them survived long enough to understand what was happening, to see their city vanishing, to know that everything they had known was ending. Lot's family escaped. Barely. They were warned. They were given time to run, but even they were not spared entirely. Lot's wife looked back. She saw the destruction, and it killed her. The text does not say she disobeyed out of wickedness. It does not say she was punished for sin. It says she looked back. That is all. She looked back toward her home, toward her life, toward the people she knew, and the light, the heat, the force of what was happening behind her took her. This is one of the saddest images in the entire biblical canon, not because she was wicked, but because she was human, because humans look back, because we cannot help it, because home calls to us even as it burns. Even when we know we should keep running, we turn, we have to see, we have to know. And sometimes the knowing costs us everything. Lot and his daughters survived. They fled to a cave in the mountains, and there, believing they were the last humans alive, that the entire world had been destroyed, the daughters made a plan. They got their father drunk. They each conceived a child by him. The text does not judge them for this. It presents it as desperate pragmatism. The world has ended. Humanity must continue. There are no other men. So they do what they believe they must do. This is what catastrophe does to people. It breaks the normal rules. It forces choices that would be unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. It creates situations where survival itself becomes an ethical wilderness, where there are no good options, only terrible ones and worse ones. The descendants of Lot's daughters became the Moabites and the Ammonites, nations that would later be enemies of Israel, but also kin, related by blood, remembered in the origin story as products of desperation and survival. This is not a story about divine blessing. It is a story about endurance in the aftermath of annihilation, about what people do when everything is gone and they are still somehow alive. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced similar disorientation. The world had not ended, but their world had. Everything familiar was gone. The people they knew were dead or dying. The city was ash, and they were left to make sense of it, to continue, to decide whether life was still worth living in a world where such destruction was possible. Many of them lived with survivor's guilt for the rest of their lives. Why did I survive when others did not? What did I do to deserve this mercy, if it is mercy? How do I honor the dead? How do I carry their memory? How do I live in a body that survived when so many bodies did not? These are questions that do not have answers. They are simply the weight that survivors carry. Lot carried it, his daughters carried it, and the memory of Sodom and Gomorrah preserved in the text carries it forward to every generation that reads the story. This is what it means to lose everything. This is what it means to survive. Not triumph, just survival, and the knowledge that survival is not the same as salvation, that you can escape the fire and still spend the rest of your life haunted by the light of it, by the memory of those who did not escape, by the pillar of salt that was once your mother standing on the plain behind you. The text does not tell us what happened to Lot afterward. He disappears from the narrative. His daughters bear children. The lineages continue, but Lot himself, the man who was righteous enough to be spared, who was warned by angels, who fled with his family and lost his wife and fathered children in a cave, Lot vanishes. The silence is heavy. Perhaps he lived out his years in obscurity. Perhaps he could not bear the weight of what he had seen. Perhaps he spent the rest of his life looking back, not physically, but in memory, replaying the night he fled, wondering if he could have saved her, if he could have done something different, if the angels were right, if the city deserved what it received. These are the questions survivors ask. They ask them in the dark. They ask them when sleep will not come. They ask them when they see smoke rising in the distance, when they smell sulphur, when they hear thunder and mistake it for something worse. Trauma does not end when the event ends. It echoes. It reshapes everything. It makes the world uncertain, makes safety an illusion, makes every moment contingent on forces beyond control. Lot knew this. The text does not say it, but the structure of the story says it. The man who was saved is also the man who lost everything, and there is no resolution, no healing, no triumphant return, just silence, just the mountains, just the cave, and the knowledge that the cities are gone, that the plain is poison, that the world has changed and will never change back. This is the real legacy of catastrophe, not the mechanics of destruction, not the question of who did it or why, but the human aftermath, the survivors who carry the memory, the generations who inherit the trauma, the landscapes that remain scarred, the stories that are told and retold, trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to extract meaning from annihilation, trying to ensure that it is not forgotten, even if it cannot be fully understood. The ancient world was full of such stories. The Sumerians had their flood, the Egyptians had their plagues, the Greeks had their tales of gods destroying cities, of heroes who defied heaven and paid for it, of entire civilizations wiped away in a day and a night. The Romans remembered the destruction of Carthage, the salting of the earth, the determination that nothing would ever grow there again. These stories were told around fires, they were carved into stone, they were sung by bards, they were copied by scribes, they were woven into the fabric of collective memory, and they were told not only to warn but to honor those who died, to honor those who survived, to honor the reality that the world is not safe, that civilization is fragile, that everything we build can be undone, and that we continue anyway, not because we are confident, but because we are human, and humans endure. We endure because we do not know how to do anything else. We build on the ruins, we plant in the ash, we tell the stories of the dead, we remember the catastrophes, and we keep going, not because we believe it cannot happen again, but because we know it can, and we choose to live anyway, to love anyway, to create anyway, knowing that all of it is temporary, that the fire is always possible, that the earth beneath us shifts, that the sky above us is not empty, that the powers that shape our world are not always benign. This knowledge does not paralyze the wise. It clarifies. It reminds us what matters, not wealth, not power, not permanence, but connection, but memory. But the attempt to live well in the time we have, to treat each other with kindness, to build things worth building even if they will not last forever, to tell true stories, to honor what was, to face what is, to move toward what might be with as much courage and decency as we can manage. The texts ask us to remember. They do not ask us to despair. They ask us to see clearly, to see that the world has always been dangerous, that it has always been beautiful, that catastrophe and creation exist side by side, that destruction and endurance are woven together, that the same sky that rains fire also gives light. The Dead Sea is still there. You can visit it. You can float in its dense water. You can stand on the shore and look out across the valley and imagine what it might have looked like before. Green, fertile, full of life. You can see the cliffs, the mountains rising on both sides, the stark beauty of the wasteland. And you can think about the cities that are not there anymore, that are buried somewhere beneath the water, beneath the sediment, beneath the weight of millennia. You can think about the people who lived there, who woke each morning and went about their lives, who had families, who had work, who had hopes and fears and joys and sorrows, who did not know that one day without warning their world would end, that fire would fall from the sky, that everything they knew would be erased, that their names would be forgotten, their stories lost, their existence reduced to a single line in a text that people thousands of years later would read and argue about and fail to fully understand. This is what history does. It reduces, it simplifies, it turns lives into narratives, people into symbols, tragedies into lessons. But beneath the narratives, the people were real, the suffering was real, the fire was real, and the memory, however distorted by time and theology and interpretation, is real. It is a memory of destruction, of loss, of survival, of the moment when everything changed and could not be changed back. The Anunnaki, if they existed, if they were beings rather than myths, if they had the power the texts describe, they are gone, now. Or they are hidden, or they are watching from distances we cannot measure. The texts say they came from heaven. They do not say they stayed. The texts say they judged cities. They do not say the judgment was always wise. The texts say they had weapons that could destroy the world. They do not say the weapons were always used justly. If they were real, they left behind ruins. They left behind stories. They left behind questions that we are still trying to answer. And they left behind us humanity, still here, still building, still destroying, still trying to understand what happened, why it happened, whether it will happen again. The answers are not in the texts. The texts are records, not explanations. They tell us what people saw, what people believed, what people survived. They do not tell us the deeper truth because the deeper truth was not available to them. They did not have our science. They did not have our perspective. They had their eyes, their memory, their need to make sense of the incomprehensible, and they wrote it down. They carved it into clay. They copied it onto parchment. They passed it down through generations who added their own interpretations, their own layers, their own attempts to understand. And now we have it. These fragments, these stories, these descriptions of fire and flood and divine judgment. And we are doing what they did. We are trying to make sense of it. We are applying the frameworks we have: science, history, archaeology, textual analysis. We are looking for evidence, for proof, for certainty. But certainty is rare, especially in deep time, especially with events that were catastrophic, that disrupted everything, that left few survivors and fewer records. What we have is enough to ask questions, not enough to answer them definitively, enough to see patterns, not enough to prove causation, enough to wonder, not enough to know. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the texts are doing exactly what they were meant to do. They are preserving memory. They are creating space for reflection. They are reminding us that the world is older than we think, stranger than we think, more dangerous than we think. They are asking us to consider possibilities we would rather dismiss. And they are doing it quietly, without insistence, without proof, with only the weight of what was written and the echoes of what was lived. Sodom and Gomorrah are gone. Whether they were destroyed by earthquake, by meteor, by volcanic event, by human conflict, or by something we do not yet have words for, they are gone. The land is salt, the water is dead, the cities are buried, and the memory remains. In Genesis, in commentary, in rabbinic tradition, in Islamic texts, in the collective imagination of every culture that has inherited the story. The memory says, this happened. People died. Fire fell. The earth was scarred. And those who survived carried the knowledge forward, warning us, teaching us, begging us to understand that safety is not guaranteed, that cities can fall, that everything we trust can be taken, and that the only response is not fear, but vigilance, not despair, but endurance, not forgetting, but remembering. Remembering what was, remembering what was lost, remembering that we are still here, still capable of creation and destruction both, still trying to find the line between them, still hoping that we can build something that lasts, knowing full well that nothing lasts forever, that the fire is always possible, that the sky is never truly empty. The Anunnaki, in the end, are less important than the question they raise, the question of who we are, of where we came from, of what we are capable of whether we are alone in our capacity for both greatness and horror, or whether that capacity has always been part of the world, part of the powers that govern it, part of the pattern that repeats across time. We build, we destroy, we endure. This is the pattern, this is what the texts show us, not answers, but the pattern. And in the pattern, if we look carefully, if we are willing to see, we might find something worth knowing. Not certainty, but clarity. the clarity that comes from facing what is difficult, from reading what is uncomfortable, from admitting that we do not know everything, that history is deeper than we thought, that the ancients might have seen things we have only recently learned to recognize. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be. The night is quiet now, or perhaps it has been quiet all along and we are only now noticing. The texts we have explored tonight are thousands of years old. They were ancient when Rome was young. They were already part of deep history when the pyramids were being built, and yet they speak to us still. They speak to us because they describe something fundamental, not just events, but the experience of living in a world where safety is conditional, where power beyond our comprehension shapes our lives, where the ground beneath us can open, where the sky can betray us, where everything can change in an instant and never change back. This is not ancient anxiety. This is human anxiety. We have carried it with us from the beginning. We carry it still. We build cities knowing they can fall. We raise families knowing they are mortal. We plant crops knowing drought can take them. We make plans knowing the future is uncertain. We love knowing loss is inevitable, and we do it anyway. We do it because the alternative is not to live at all, and so we live. We live in the shadow of catastrophe. We live with the memory of what has been lost. We live with the stories that remind us again and again that nothing is permanent, that all of this, all of it, is temporary. The texts do not offer comfort. They were not written to comfort. They were written to preserve, to remember, to warn, to teach. And what they teach is not that we are doomed, but that we are vulnerable, that we have always been vulnerable, that vulnerability is the condition of existence, not a flaw in it. That strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the willingness to continue despite it. Lot walked into the mountains with his daughters. He had lost his home. He had lost his wife. He had lost his city. He had lost everything except his life and the lives of his children. And he continued. He found a cave. He made it shelter. His daughters conceived children. The lineage continued. The story did not end with destruction. It moved through destruction and came out the other side, wounded, diminished, traumatized, but alive. This is what endurance looks like. Not triumph, not heroism, just the refusal to stop. Just the act of continuing when continuation seems pointless, when the world has shown you that everything you build can be taken, that everyone you love can be lost, that the gods or the powers or the universe itself is indifferent to your suffering. You continue anyway. You continue because that is what life does. It continues. It adapts. It endures. Even in the wasteland. Even in the ruins. Even in the cave in the mountains with nothing left but the memory of fire and the knowledge that the plain below is poison and will remain poison for longer than anyone can imagine. You continue. The Sumerians continued. After the flood that they said destroyed the world, they continued. They rebuilt their cities. They resumed their rituals. They wrote new tablets. They carried the memory forward, but they did not let it stop them. The survivors of Hiroshima continued. They rebuilt their city. They raised children. They told their stories, painful as they were, because the stories mattered, because memory matters, because if we forget what destruction looks like, we become more likely to cause it again. And so they remembered, and so they continued. The ancient texts are memories of continuation. They are records of people who survived catastrophes and refused to let the catastrophes be the final word. They carved their survival into clay. They wrote it onto scrolls. They embedded it in their sacred texts, not as victory, as persistence, as proof that even after the fire, even after the flood, even after the sky falls and the cities burn, some fragment of humanity remains, and that fragment is enough to rebuild, enough to remember, enough to keep the story going. We are that fragment now. We are the continuation of lines that stretch back through millennia, through countless catastrophes, through collapses and dark ages and moments when it seemed like everything would end. But it did not end. It changed. It diminished. It suffered. But it did not end. And here we are, still asking questions, still reading the old texts, still trying to understand what our ancestors saw, what they survived, what they were trying to tell us. The Anunnaki, if they ever existed, are silent now. The gods, if they were ever present, have withdrawn. The sky that once rained fire is quiet, and We are left with the aftermath, with the texts, with the ruins, with the questions, with the memory of what was lost and the knowledge that loss is not the end, that after loss comes continuation, that after destruction comes rebuilding, that after silence comes the voice that says, I am still here, I survived, I remember, and I will tell you what I saw so that you might understand, so that you might prepare, so that you might know that the world is not what it seems, that danger is real, that catastrophe is possible, but also that survival is possible, that endurance is possible, that life continues even in the shadow of death. Tonight we have walked through shadow. We have looked at texts that describe destruction. We have considered possibilities that are uncomfortable. We have asked whether the ancient world was different than we thought, whether the stories we dismiss as mythology might be memories, whether the catastrophes described in sacred texts might have been real events. Recorded in the only language available, we have not found answers. Answers are rare. Answers require evidence that has been lost or buried or eroded by time. What we have found is resonance, the feeling that the texts are showing us something, that beneath the theological interpretation there is a layer of experience, of witnessing, of survival. That the people who wrote these texts were not inventing fantasies but preserving realities, doing their best to explain what they had seen using the frameworks they had. And we have found questions about what the Anunnaki were, questions about what destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, questions about whether advanced technology existed in the ancient world and was lost, questions about whether the catastrophes that ended civilizations were natural or deliberate, questions about whether we are alone in our capacity for destruction, or whether that capacity has older roots, deeper origins, connections to powers we do not fully understand. These questions do not have easy answers. They may not have answers at all. But they are worth asking. They are worth sitting with. They are worth carrying into the night as we close this exploration and return to our own lives, our own cities, our own vulnerabilities. The fire that consumed Sodom and Gomorrah, whether it was natural or technological, whether it was divine judgment or human conflict or something else entirely, that fire is still burning in the texts. It burns in the memory of Lot's wife turned to salt. It burns in the smoke rising like a furnace. It burns in the warnings embedded in the story, the knowledge that cities can fall, that safety is fragile, that we must be careful, must be vigilant, must remember what happens when boundaries are crossed, when powers are provoked, when thresholds are exceeded. The texts ask us to remember, not to live in fear, but to live with awareness, to know that the world is more dangerous than we pretend, that history is longer and stranger than the stories we tell in daylight, that the forces that shape our world, whether we call them gods or powers or simply the mechanics of a universe we do not fully comprehend, those forces are not always gentle, not always just, not always concerned with our welfare. And yet we continue. We build our cities knowing they can fall. We light our fires knowing they can consume. We reach toward the sky knowing it might reach back. We do this because we are human, because we cannot help it, because creation is in our nature as much as destruction, because hope persists even when logic says it should not, because love continues even in the presence of loss, because meaning can be found even in suffering, or perhaps especially in suffering, in the act of enduring what cannot be avoided, of carrying what cannot be put down, of living fully in a world that offers no guarantees. The texts we have explored tonight offer no guarantees either. They offer memory, they offer warning, they offer the knowledge that we are not the first to face catastrophe, and we will not be the last, that the pattern repeats, that the cycle turns, that what was will be again, in different forms perhaps, but with the same essential structure: rise, fall, endurance, rebuilding, memory, warning, and then the cycle again. This is not pessimism. This is realism. This is the acknowledgement that history is not a line moving steadily upward, but a spiral, a wheel, a pattern that touches the same points again and again while moving slowly forward. We are further along than the Sumerians. We have more knowledge, more technology, more capacity for both creation and destruction. But we are not fundamentally different. We still build. We still destroy. We still ask why. We still search for meaning. We still tell stories about what happened, about who we are, about what we hope to become. And our descendants, if we have them, if we survive long enough to have them, will read our stories the way we read, The stories of Sodom and Gomorrah. They will ask what we meant, they will debate our intentions, they will try to separate fact from interpretation, they will wonder what we actually saw, what we actually knew, what we were trying to tell them, and perhaps they will do what we have done tonight. They will sit with the texts, they will read carefully, they will resist easy answers, they will acknowledge uncertainty, they will try to understand, not to judge, not to prove, just to understand, to see clearly, to remember, to honour what was by trying to comprehend it as fully as possible. This is the work, not of solving mysteries, but of maintaining memory, of keeping the stories alive, of reading the old texts with enough respect to take them seriously, and enough humility to admit we cannot fully understand them, of asking questions that have no final answers, but that clarify what we do know, what we can know, what will always remain uncertain. The night is deep now, the texts are still, there, carved in clay, written on parchment, preserved in translations, copied and recopied, passed down through generations, waiting for anyone who wants to read them. They will wait longer. They have waited thousands of years already. They can wait thousands more. But for tonight we have sat with them, we have listened, we have asked what they might be telling us. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the asking is the point. Perhaps the willingness to consider uncomfortable possibilities, to sit with difficult questions, to resist the comfort of easy answers. Perhaps that willingness is what keeps us human, what keeps us honest, what keeps us connected to the long chain of people who came before us, who survived catastrophes we can barely imagine, who wrote down what they saw so that we might know, so that we might remember, so that we might understand that we are part of something larger, older, more enduring than our individual lives. The embers are fading now, the fire that lit. This exploration is burning down to ash. The darkness is coming back. But it is a gentle darkness, a quiet darkness, the kind that comes at the end of things, when the questions have been asked even if not answered, when the stories have been told even if not fully understood, when the work has been done as well as it can be done, and now there is only rest. Rest and the knowledge that the texts remain, that the questions remain, that the memory remains, that Sodom and Gomorrah, however they were destroyed, are still part of our story, still part of the long human reckoning with catastrophe and survival, still speaking to us across the millennia, still asking us to remember, to understand, to carry forward what they learned in fire and ash. We carry it now. We carry the memory. We carry the questions. We carry the awareness that the world is fragile, that cities can fall, that fire can rain from the sky, that everything changes, that nothing lasts, and yet that survival is possible, that endurance is possible, that meaning can be found even in the ruins. We carry this because they carried it, because Lot carried it, because Utnapishtim carried it, because every survivor of every catastrophe has carried it, and we will carry it forward as far as we can, as long as we can, until our own time ends and others take up the burden, read our texts, ask their questions, try to understand what we saw, what we knew, what we were trying to tell them. The cycle continues, the pattern repeats, the wheel turns, and in the turning there is meaning. Not the meaning we might wish for, not comfort, not certainty, but the meaning that comes from continuing, from enduring, from refusing to forget, from keeping the fire lit even as the night closes in, from telling the stories even when the stories are difficult, from asking the questions even when the questions have no answers. This is what we do. This is what we have always done. This is what makes us human, not knowledge, not power, but memory and the willingness to carry it. Wherever we go, however long we last, until the fire comes again or does not come, until the cities fall or stand, until the end or the beginning or whatever comes after. We carry the memory, we keep the questions alive, we honour what was, and we continue, always, we continue. The night is quiet now, the texts have said what they will say, the questions rest, and so can we. Not in certainty, not in answers, but in the knowledge that we have listened, that we have tried to understand, that we have sat with the difficult and not looked away, that we have remembered, and perhaps that is all any of us can do. Remember, understand as best we can, continue. The rest is silence, the rest is darkness, the rest is the deep quiet of history settling like ash. And in that quiet, if we listen carefully, we might hear something, not answers, but echoes, the voices of those who came before, the survivors, the witnesses, the ones who wrote it down, so we would know, so we would remember, so we would understand that we are not alone in this, that others have walked through fire, that others have endured, that others have asked the same questions, faced the same fears, carried the same burdens, and survived, and continued, and passed the memory forward to us, and now we pass it forward, into the darkness, into the future, into whatever comes next, carrying the knowledge that the world is dangerous and beautiful, that catastrophe and creation exist together, that destruction and endurance are woven into the same fabric, that we are fragile and strong, that we build and we destroy, that we remember and we forget, that we are human, and that, in the end, is enough. And as the embers dim, the night can hold what remains. Questions without urgency, memories without demand, a quiet that does not need answers to feel complete. The texts are still there, carved in clay, written on parchment, preserved in translations. They will wait. They have waited thousands of years already. They can wait thousands more. But for tonight we have sat with them. We have listened. We have asked what they might be telling us. And perhaps that is enough.